to understand and come back to the discussion on the current situation of geopolitics, especially from the perspective of Bangladesh in terms of the role of regional powers. So geographically, Arakan has a very importance because of its location. It is now going to be a pivotal point of connectivity between South and Southeast Asia. And due to the volatile situation in Arakan and Rohingya crisis, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and regional powers could not advance their other agenda. So BCIM could not be flourished. BIMSTEC was not, as expected, functioning. One of the major reason was this, the complexity of this Arakan issue. So if we now come back to the Rohingya and this, the perception of Myanmar politicians and Burmese politicians and policymakers in terms of their national security concern, we also need to keep those in our mind when we will be analyzing the issue of sustainability from the Bangladesh perspective. And civil society in Myanmar often mirrored the ruling elite's perception on Rohingya like they are not Burmese, they should leave the country, and there is no place for them in future of Burma. And this is across the board. Sometimes when we see it from outside, we think that probably the civil society, they have more neutral kind of views, but unfortunately not. I visited Myanmar and I talked with the people there, even the academicians. We found that at least in a modest way, they also take the same positions, that these are not our people, we cannot take the burden. So anti-Rohingya sentiment is very pervasive there. So it's across the country. So they are unified in terms of Rohingya. So there is no big division within the Myanmar society regarding the position that the government is taking. So not only Rohingya, so we all know that Myanmar also has some other ethnic minority issues who are in conflict with the government since 1950s. But the military regime basically did not brand the other ethnic groups as non-settlers or settlers, but they basically termed the Rohingyas as a Bengali settlers. And after the 1982 citizenship law, Rohingya Muslim became basically stateless in their ancestors' home. So now if we come to the point of the discussion of what are the consequences of ongoing violence here. The ongoing violence and civilian government's unwillingness prove Rohingya situation is getting worse. NLD government and political leaders failed to address the communal issue, rather becoming part of the ethnocentric politics. And until today, more than 600,000 Rohingyas are now in Bangladesh and many are waiting there. So we all know this background. So now if we come a little bit about Bangladesh-Myanmar relationship, and we said that in this paper that this is an unknown territory for us. Even 10, 15 years back, a major section of Bangladesh society also didn't have the idea that Bangladesh has border with Myanmar. We did a very small survey 10 years back and asked even the educated people that with which countries do Bangladesh has border. Most of the respondents said that only India. So Myanmar is like an unknown territory to us. We even don't know this country. This is one of the reasons is that this is a closed country for long, and there was no communication in terms of travel, tourism, or any other. But after many years, so one of our ex-ambassadors is sitting here, and he knows that history much better than anyone else, that after many years, Bangladeshi national carrier Biman resumed their Dhaka-Yangon-Dhaka flight twice a week from the second week of December 2013. That's the starting point that when Myanmar opened it up for Bangladeshis to go and to have some kind of relationship. On the other side, Myanmar did not open any trade or cultural center in Bangladesh except their chancery, and very limited cultural sports exchange program conducted as yet after first Rohingya influx in Bangladesh. So this also we have to keep it in mind to understand the real problem. Now if we come to the real geopolitics, that what's really happening in that region, and there are very important role to be played by ASEAN, but if you see that the Myanmar, since it belongs to the ASEAN Regional Forum, and due to her geographical location, while Bangladesh is a founder member of SAARC Regional Forum, they had different interests in the regional kind of forums and connectivity issues. And during military rule in Myanmar, ASEAN is the only forum which always backed its members in the name of non-interference. So ASEAN never questioned the form of government or human rights issues of countries like Myanmar. So both countries are the members, Bangladesh and Myanmar are the members of recently formed regional alliance, the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation, BIMSTEC. But as I was saying in the beginning, that it also did not function well. So the international community, especially if we see from the regional point of view, ASEAN has repeatedly failed to address the Rohingya Muslim plight in the name of so-called non-interference. And this failure is consistent with the spirit of ASEAN and its vision, inconsistent with the vision. And especially when they had this ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, they also failed to fulfill its special mandate to promote and protect human rights and across the region. So geopolitical importance of Arakan is now getting high priority in surrounding countries, and political instability in Arakan has hampered the different regional connectivity projects, like the Asian Highway, multilateral connectivity projects. And because the Rohingya-dominated Myanmar's western border area has become a major impediment to multilateral relations as well as source of regional destabilization. Unfortunately, many disputed issues make fragility and mistrust between these neighboring countries. And Rohingya represent a long-standing crisis, but regional bodies have not taken any initiative to seek sustainable solutions. Although Bangladesh has no direct land border with China, but we are seeing that the Chinese influence is increasing day by day due to geopolitical constraints and interests. So Myanmar's foreign policy is primarily focused on ASEAN countries, from which it gains political support in international forums. So if we just link it a bit with the different initiatives being taken by BIMSTEC or BCIM, Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar, we'll be seeing that all the proposed Asian highway route, like number 3 from India to Bangladesh via Cox's Bazar to Burma, which is called AH41 route from India, Bangladesh to Myanmar, is not a single kind of this initiative has started yet. So India and Myanmar have also tried to establish a gas pipeline from the Situi field to Myanmar to Kolkata in India via Bangladesh. And Myanmar and India, both countries are now avoiding this shorter road because Mongdu and Teknaf, where the Rohingya refugees problem exists, as a serious concern. So this whole regional destabilization things has now been intensified because of the new influx that has happened in last few months. And now a new dimension has been added with it. And we are seeing that now this in Assam, where the Hindu-Muslim communal riots are also being influenced and being directed towards this Rohingya issue. So the Hindu community in Assam treats all Muslims as settlers and originally from Bangladesh. Their perspective on the Rohingya is very similar to that of the Rakhine Buddhists. And Subhashish Bosu Roy Choudhury, an expert of migration patterns on the India-Myanmar-Bangladesh frontier, he said in his article that unless checked firmly, the Rohingya influx could become a big headache in northeast India. So India is also very concerned about this Rohingya issue. So it is now a dilemma for India, whether to allow the Rohingya to become a new burden for its northeastern region or whether it should prevent the flow of refugees. It is now going to be a pivotal point of connectivity between South and Southeast Asia, and due to the volatile situation in Arakan and the Rohingya crisis, Bangladesh, Burma, they could not, or even India could not go with their bilateral and multilateral agendas. And now it has been added with all this kind of the ethnocentric, religiocentric kind of the concerns. Now we are seeing that there is also another dimension which is coming here with economic and corporate interest. So increased corporate acquisition of land for mining, timber, agriculture, power and water has become a problem in Arakan. And according to the Burmese law, burnt land becomes the government managed land. And recently we have seen that after the new influx that many of the Rohingya villages has been burned because automatically this will become the government land. So China has already invested significantly in the Rakhine state with a US $2.45 billion pipeline from Rakhine to Yunnan. And Beijing-based CITIC group also building a deep sea port there. A $3 billion economic development zone is also at the stage of work in progress. So the economic and corporate interest is also very high at this region. So if now we just come to the major part of the discussion and analysis, that what the India's role and Chinese role there in case of this Rohingya crisis. So if we see it firstly from the India's point of view, the India's Act East policy basically is trying to use Myanmar as a gateway to the Southeast Asia. India needs Myanmar for coordinating patrols in the southern Indian Ocean, and Rakhine State is a crucial link for India's hydrocarbon and trade ambitions. However, India is lagging behind from China in developing strategic and economic ties with Myanmar. New Delhi's years of courting Myanmar have yielded only uncooked project. And this explains why India has soft pedal on the Rohingya issue. So we also have to understand that why India was so silent when this Rohingya issue came into forefront. Now the more important part of the discussion is probably how we see the role of China. And in this article, you will be finding that I was probably a bit provocative when used this subtitle that China finds opportunity in current crisis. So it's a very unique opportunity for China. This Rohingya crisis, it has become an opportunity for them. And if we go back to the context of the Chinese opportunity, then we'll be seeing that Rohingya issue did not directly affect China's border security like northern Kachin or eastern Shan states. It is also conceivable that China now relates Myanmar Rohingya issue with its own Uyghur problem at Xinjiang province. And that's why any criticism of Myanmar government could negate China's non-interference policy and open the way for criticism of its own policies against the Uyghur minority. So we have to keep those things in mind. Sometimes we are seeing that in the civil society in Bangladesh are very critical and restless and impatient, that they're saying that why China is not taking a very strong position or not putting lots of power and influence on the Myanmar government. But we also have to understand that this is the background that China is maintaining, and they cannot do it because of these own internal reasons.
We need to conclude.
How many minutes? Sorry?
1 minute.
Okay. And I get to one more, please. Chinese experts have been eager and keen to blame the Rohingya issues more on the legacy of the British colonialism than the Myanmar government. So this Rohingya issue has given China their opportunities in terms of investment, because a Rohingya-free Arakan would be more beneficial for Chinese investment because of their economic zone will now be more flourished, their pipeline will be more secured, and also their other interests will be settled. So in that sense, the current status quo of the delicate domestic power balance in Myanmar is clearly working in China's favor. So now if we now come, and that's why we concluded in this paper that China has leveraged the humanitarian crisis into a diplomatic opportunity. So now what's the learning for us? What Bangladesh can learn from all this geopolitics complexity? Before going to the last slides, that I asked, or we raised few questions that we need to answer before making our strategies. The first question is, could we assess correctly and timely the position of China and India towards Rohingya crisis? Second is the future repatriation is a myth or reality? The third question we need to ask ourselves is, are we already aligned with China-Myanmar-driven solution package? Do you have any other options? And where do we stand then? Our conclusion is again a bit provocative. Like the Rohingyas, we are also standing in no man's land. In Bangla, sometimes we say that, "Pothik tumi poth haraiyacho." It looks like we also lost our path. In terms of the short-term solution, sustainable solution, we concluded that the humanitarian solution is possible because Bangladesh's long experience and expertise on disaster management, but a long-term political solution is still elusive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Haqq. The next presenter is Dr. Robin Ramcharan from Asia Center, Thailand. He will be speaking on the role of ASEAN in Rohingya refugee crisis. Dr. Ramcharan, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So, dear friends, I'm Robin Ramcharan. As the chair just said, I'm from Asia Center in Bangkok. We are a think tank that does research, evidence-based research on regional human rights issues. Impact of UN mechanisms, national human rights institutions, and in line with this conference, I should mention we will also have a conference in August of this year on the Rohingya crisis, looking at the multidimensional aspects of the great tragedy. Before I proceed to my key points, I do wish to thank the organizers for inviting me and for their kind support and getting me here to Dhaka. With that said, let me outline my 6 major observations or points, key points. One is, the first is the following. How do I approach this topic of ASEAN's role? Where did I start? I started with the idea of what's ASEAN's responsibility, right, in this whole crisis. And so I think role as a term is fine. I have no problem with that. But let's just think about responsibility for a second. And let's be clear that the primary responsibility for this lies on the state of Myanmar. But then, coming from a political science perspective, how do other actors impact, and in that sense, what is their responsibility? So in the case of ASEAN, I'm thinking of 3 specific elements. One is, my talk is premised on the idea that power matters in international relations, and that the exercise of power or the signaling of power matters. So that's one observation, and ASEAN could do that. Secondly, regional organizations like international organizations do have the capacity to effect change positively in situations like these. There are examples both in interstate and intrastate conflicts where international organizations, regional organizations have made a difference in either preventing or calming, stopping the outbreak of ongoing violence or the outbreak of violence. And 3, I am coming at this with a third thing in mind, which is the adopted norms of ASEAN in recent times. I'll come back to that, the rights norms. So that was my first broad set of observations. The second broad observation is that there have been numerous calls by international NGOs in particular on ASEAN to do something. And so I just want to reiterate some of the elements of those calls, the major points. I'm thinking of Amnesty International, ASEAN Human Rights, Parliamentarians for Human Rights, Human Rights Watch, and so on. They've called for an end to the violence, ensure access to all humanitarian agencies, regional, international, ensure voluntary return of Rohingya refugees to Myanmar in safe conditions, address the root causes of the crisis, such as entrenched discrimination, support the fact-finding mission of the UN, Human Rights Council, impose comprehensive arms embargo in Myanmar, and so on. So I just wanted to recall, as we are assessing ASEAN's responsibility, the calls made by the international community of a very serious, credible international entities, organizations. Third, what has been ASEAN's response? Well, I should say it's been problematic, I think. And we may recall 2 things. One is the treatment of the persons heading towards, back in 2015, towards ASEAN shores, the deaths at sea in some cases, and the refouling in some cases, to great objection of the international community. That's one. Of course, we have heard, we know that ASEAN countries, some have taken many Rohingya people and given them protection. But even that is problematic because many of them are not party to the refugee conventions, notably Thailand, Malaysia. And I would note on that score that just now, I think the Malaysian authorities have intercepted a group of Rohingya people who made it to Malaysian shores, and they have said that they will give them, take care of them, give them the appropriate assistance, and then they will turn them over to the immigration authorities. So that already is something problematic, where presumably they will then be, I don't know, in the case of Thailand, they process them under the immigration rules, and so they are obviously, by definition, illegal. So that's one thing, ASEAN's response to the crisis. So that humanitarian dimension I wanted to note. And the second thing in relation to ASEAN's response is, by and large, the inaction since, especially, well, for a long time, but especially since August of last year. So what has ASEAN done, just to recall, the timid measures? This is my fourth or fifth point, I forget now. So my fourth major point, the responses have been timid. So they have not been able even to put ASEAN, sorry, the issue, the crisis, on the agenda of ASEAN. That's, at least might have been a good first step. Despite calls for an emergency summit, there hasn't been that kind of response. There was a sideline event at the UN General Assembly in, I think it was in 2017, and there was a chairman's statement. The chairman at that time was the Philippines. But of course, that's already a bit problematic in and of itself. The nature of the statement, condemning the ARSA attacks and so on, but not going far enough to condemn all sides, right, in this attack. And so Malaysia, and I think Indonesia, but in particular Malaysia, I believe, if I've got my facts right, distance itself from that particular statement. And then finally, at the ASEAN-Australia meeting summit recently, last month, what you saw was, yes, the issue came up on the agenda, but from the perspective of securitization, right? So that was the angle that came across, that came out of Australia, securitization. The ASEAN chair, Singapore, noted the problem, the potential for so-called radicalization across the region, the regional impact of the crisis. So that was my fourth set of observations. The timid response. Fifth set, how do we explain this? So one is, of course, everybody knows ASEAN's great vaunted norm of non-interference. That's a core principle of ASEAN, so they do not interfere in each other's affairs. It will be interesting to examine ASEAN's approach to R2P itself, a responsibility to protect, in light of this principle of non-interference. And by the way, I must mention that R2P although it is much talked about, there is great disagreement on R2P. I think we all know that. It is not yet a law. It may be an emerging norm, but it is still open for debate. What did the President of the General Assembly do when it was introduced into the General Assembly? The President said, I put it on the agenda, but now I put on my country's hat and I oppose it, right? So just to bring that little anecdote into discussions of R2P. Much of the world, frankly, is still attached to the non-interference principle. There is the famous ASEAN way, and for those who speak Malay, forgive me, I don't. But you may have heard of the term musjawara muwafaq. Maybe our Malaysian friend can correct my pronunciation. So, which is a kind of a consensual way, non-confrontational way of doing business. Not embarrassing each other, certainly not in public. And ASEAN has held to that quite well. There is the decision-making of ASEAN. There were discussions about going towards a majority decision-making, but they retained the consensual approach. So that, again, doesn't allow for speedy handling of these kinds of crises. Very importantly, there is a lack of normative consensus, I would say, across the region. In particular on human rights norms and values. Yes, ASEAN adopted the Asean Charter. Good governance, rule of law, human rights are in the Charter. But each state, it's up to each state to implement and adopt and pursue as they can or are willing to. But I must mention that there was, at the time of the adoption of the Charter, we must be aware that there was a great division inside of ASEAN. There were two camps, essentially the CLMV countries and the others, which by that time you could class as progressives. But the debates in ASEAN, as reported by ASEAN ambassadors and so on who were there, bogged down and were quite contentious, fractious, to the point where they had to be divided into different rooms. And so the ASEAN chair was running from one room to the other. Okay, he said this. Okay, he said that. Okay, he said this. Do you agree? Do you agree? Right? And the ASEAN human rights mechanism and subsequent declarations were compromises, minimum compromises reached. Many argue, of course, they're insufficient. They're not protective entities. They are promotional, and it's a promotional entity. But as part of the series of compromises, I come back to the decision-making. They sacrificed the move towards majority decision-making in favor of having a human rights mechanism. But just to tell you the contentious debates that they had over even adopting a human rights mechanism. We know also that there is generally a regression in democracy and rights in the region. So if you have President Duterte, if you have General Prayut in Thailand, maybe it's unreasonable to expect that we will have much movement at the ASEAN level on the Rohingya issue. I should note two more things. One is the economic aspect, and that is the move towards an integrated ASEAN, economic integration, which is proceeding slowly. And in that context, I just take the one example of Thailand, the deepening investment ties between Thailand and Myanmar, and the two are in process of developing an industrial zone that will link up with the Dawei zone, two parts of Gulf of Thailand and Myanmar side. So there are investment, economic relations that are underway. And finally, again, this is all in my fifth point, explaining ASEAN's responses, the timid responses. The geopolitics has been sufficiently mentioned. I would merely highlight the powerful presence of China in the region. And I mentioned the divide between the CLMV and the other countries in relation to human rights. Well, that divide also applies in terms of the influence of China. Very strong in Myanmar, of course, as we all know, but in Cambodia, Laos, and to some extent, Vietnam. And in recent times, we should also see that divide, I'm sorry, one more point, that divide prevented, for example, a unified ASEAN response to China in the China Sea a couple of years ago in Phnom Penh. So that's to tell that's to bring in the geopolitical dimension. bottom line is, assuming that the rulers of Myanmar are rational beings, rationally calculating all of this, logically calculating, then perhaps there's no better time than to do what they do than the present. Especially when you have the world superpower, at least symbolically and maybe practically, I don't want to use the word retreat, but let's say appearing to withdraw, right? So that doesn't help. Then who's left? I had great hopes. I have great hopes for example, India to pick up the slack, for maybe the European Union to do something, maybe Japan to do something, but let's see. So let me end with the sixth set of observations, and that has to do with maybe just some very small recommendations in the spirit of solutions, the title of this event, the approach of this event. One is to call upon the ASEAN states to be better compliant with international refugee standards, and that means adopting the conventions. You know, no treaty. We mentioned some. We heard some difficulties with the refugee convention itself this morning. No treaty is perfect, but at least we have that treaty, and let's at least try to use it in progressive ways. Respect. ASEAN should respect its own normative commitments on human rights. Number two. Number three. It would help greatly, in line with what I've said, if ASEAN were to move to a majority decision-making model. There have been suggestions on certain issues that there could be smaller groups on particular issues with the countries directly affected, for example, to have majority decision-making as subgroups, for example. Let's see how that goes. And finally, you know, if it will help to move along the discussion and inject a sense of urgency to the institution, ASEAN wants to deal with, I mean the leaders of ASEAN, many want to deal with this. It is a problem for them. So what they could do, one mechanism might be, okay, to recognize the linkages between internal political unrest due to rights violations and regional instability. It would be nice if we could address the crises like this, like the one affecting the Rohingya people, the ethnic cleansing, genocide, crimes, war crimes, and so on, simply because we are human beings. I think we all can agree to that. But here, coming back to the geopolitics theme, if it takes the securitization of the issue, however problematic it is, to spur action, then I invite you to think, is that something useful? And I will end it there, and thank you very much for allowing me to speak and for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ramcharan, and particularly thank you for finishing it within time. The next presentation is by Dr. Nehginpao Kipgen of Jindal School of International Affairs, India. He will be speaking on consensual political transition in Myanmar and the Rohingya Conundrum. Dr. Kipgen, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. And also I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. In fact, this is my first time in Bangladesh. So far I have enjoyed it. It's similar to India, where I come from, in many respects. And today I would like to focus on the domestic politics, because most of us have talked about from the perspective of international community or from the outside world. And someone who has done extensive research and publications on Myanmar politics, I would like to focus on what leads to this kind of Rohingya crisis at this level. What triggers them? What is the long-term solution for this crisis? And I would like to have two arguments. The first is the role of three important factors inside Myanmar, which could be critical for sustainable solution for the Rohingya crisis. And the second argument I would like to make is regarding the importance of ethnic identity and citizenship in the process for long-term solutions. Before I come to that, I would like to base my argument on democratization theory. As a political scientist teaching courses on political science and international relations, I would like to have some theoretical foundation here. In transition from authoritarian regime to democracy is not always a smooth thing, or not always a smooth transition. And it often takes different forms and different types. And I would like to talk here about four types of democratic transition. The first one is what they call in political science incremental transition or gradual democratization. And the second one is transition through rupture. And the third one is transition through protracted revolutionary struggle. And the fourth one is transition through transaction. And I would like to focus on the fourth one, transition through transaction. When we say political transition with consensual kind of agreement, what does it mean? Especially in the context of Myanmar or Burma, if you look at the history, it got independence from the British in 1948. Then since 1962, it was under military dictatorship. And until 2010. And if you look at events, circumstances preceding those developments, the kind of democracy or political arrangement that we see in Myanmar today is what we call a hybrid regime or a hybrid political arrangement. So this was possible because of what we call in political science consensual transition, meaning that the opposition elites and the authoritarian leaders come to an agreement where they set aside some of their differences and compromise on some other sets of their differences and decide to work together for the betterment of the country. So that's what we see in the case of Myanmar. Many people ask questions why Aung San Suu Kyi is not speaking out, for example. I would like to address some of those issues as well. But the first thing, why I see that, for number one, the military. Number two is the elected civilian leadership. And number three is the general public. I see these three factors or elements as key to a sustainable solution, especially a long-term solution. And this doesn't necessarily mean that I undermine the role of international community. Definitely it's important to have international pressure. But I see that ultimately, the solution has to come from within, where I see these three important elements as a key to a long-term solution. Why do I say that? The first one, the military. If you analyze or look at the 2008 Constitution, it clearly shows that the military is still the most powerful element in Myanmar hybrid regime. Just to give a few examples, the military holds three most important security-related ministries: Home, Defense, and Border Affairs. And much more than that, there is one council called National Defense and Security Council, which is the highest decision-making body under the Constitution. And there are 11 members in that council, and 6 of them are either military leaders or military representatives. Of course, the president has to authorize, but in terms of a vote, the military has the upper hand. So if you look at the Rohingya crisis entirely, what we call clearance operations that was launched in 2016 as well as 2017, all these works were done or, let's say, supported by the military leadership. So we know that based on the structure that we see, the hybrid regime that we see in Myanmar under the 2008 constitution, without the support or without the cooperation of the military leadership, it is almost impossible to have any kind of solution in the long run. I'll be happy to take questions later, and I'll come to the second point, the second factor. The elected civilian leader. Of course, I already said that the military is the most important or most powerful element, but that doesn't mean that the civilian government does not have power. For example, if you look at the last election in 2015, the National League for Democracy has majority in both houses of the parliament. Not just that, across the country, the whole majority. Not only that, they have to nominate and eventually confirm through the parliament for a president, which is the responsibility of the civilian government. So there are some limitations to what the civilian leadership or government can do, but if you look at the vote that they received in 2015 election, so there is a public trust on the government that they could deliver something if they are seriously taking the initiative. But the question is again then whether they would be willing to do that. We can talk about that later as well. And the third factor that I would like to discuss here is the role of general public. So anybody who have been to the country, Myanmar, would know what I'm talking about. And most of you would also notice by watching or reading some international news, is that the overwhelming majority, not just the Burmans, but many ethnic minorities, are also of the view that Rohingyas are illegal immigrants coming from Bangladesh. So when there is such overwhelming opinion about this issue, of course, if you look at, there is a lot of tension, differences between the military leadership and the civilian government. But when it comes to this Rohingya issue, this is not something that I am necessarily supporting, but the opinion, the overwhelming opinion is that they are on the same page. So here the point that I'm trying to make is, it is the people who elected NLD government. So for the eventual solution of the Rohingya crisis, I see that the role of, when I say the people, it also includes civil society and the media fraternity as well. So I see that this people's voice or people's support or opinion initiatives are also very critical to finding a long-term solution. And then now I would like to come to the second set of argument. And I would like to argue that ethnic identity, many of us have not talked about. Because when we say Rohingya here, everyone are free and open to use the word Rohingya. I just want to make some correction here. So far, I have not seen anybody saying that it's a Rohingya. In Myanmar, they call it Rohingya. And here we keep saying Rohingya. And yesterday we talked to our Rohingya friend, and he said in their own mother tongue, they call it Rohingya. So, but in Myanmar, they call it Rohingya. So what happens is that now we are talking about repatriation and integration. Unless these two elements or these two issues are addressed, I do not see any long-term solution. First, ethnic identity. Why do I say there are 135 ethnic races in Myanmar? And of course, we can keep on debating whether those are really a true classification of the people themselves. But that's another question. But officially, there are 135 national races, and among those, the government doesn't put the list of Rohingya as one ethnic group. That's why one of the previous speakers talked about the difference between other ethnic minorities and Rohingya in Myanmar. So other ethnic minorities are fighting for autonomy and federalism, whereas Rohingyas are fighting for recognition and citizenship. They are not at that level of the other ethnic minorities yet. So even, let's say, after the agreement reached between Bangladesh and Myanmar, and yesterday, yesterday, published in AFP News, saying that, RFA News, saying that I tried to confirm with our brother from UNHCR, but he's not quite confident yet. There has been an agreement between Myanmar government and UNDP and UNHCR so that they can be part of this repatriation process. But MOU is yet to be drafted and agreed upon and signed by both parties. So let's say finally all these things come in play and they are allowed to go back to the country. But the bigger question is, will the government recognize them as Rohingya, or will they impose the identity of what we call Bengali? So if that's the case, what would be the reaction, the response of these our brothers and sisters from the Rohingya community? Will they be willing to compromise on the name itself? Or will they insist on saying that we should be called and we are entitled and we have the right to be called what we want to be called? That's Rohingya. I think many people fail to understand. I think this is a very big challenge that is coming up ahead. And so far, there is no commitment from the Myanmar government or either the military leadership, the civilian authorities saying that they will recognize these Rohingyas once they go back to the country. That's the first thing. And the other one, citizenship, which is very much interlinked or intertwined with this ethnic identity. Okay, let's say if the Myanmar government, international community, including Bangladesh or UNHCR, UNDP, they have agreed and they are allowed to settle, and let's say even the government is willing to recognize as Rohingyas, will they consider or will they allow them to become a citizen again? Of course, it's not that. See here, I would like to make one very important point that many scholars and many, especially activists or these rights activists often tend to say or try to portray this as a conflict between Muslims and Buddhists. I would like to make it here very clear that this has nothing to do with, of course, you can say that there are instances where it seems, but the fundamental problem is about ethnic identity and citizenship. It is not about religion. For example, there are many Muslims inside the country who assume Burmese names and they integrate into the Burmese society, the larger Burmese society, and they have their citizenship. So, eventually, whether this citizenship issue would be given with the name what we call Rohingya. So these are intertwined, interrelated, as I said, but I think this is the largest or the greater challenge than what we see humanitarian problem. Of course, yesterday one of the chairs mentioned about how important is the role of international community, because it is why Myanmar is responding. Because initially, many people didn't believe that they would allow back to receive these refugees, but they started taking some actions, building infrastructures. But the question is, again, coming back to identity, ethnic identity. When I say identity, you can talk about religious identity, many identity, but what I'm talking about here is ethnic identity. Will they be considered, accepted as Rohingyas, the way they want and the way many people would love to see? So now, recently, there was an agreement between Bangladesh and Myanmar to repatriate this Rohingya population under the 1993 convention or agreement or the pact. What does it mean? It basically means that you, a refugee or the Rohingya, needs to produce that they were there in the country, like a proof of settlement or belonging to Myanmar. But again here, the problem is that, as you and I, many of us know that many of them fled just overnight and in a hurry, and there is a concern that many of them would not have such documents even produced in the first place. So there was an agreement that in 2 years' time, the entire Rohingya population would be repatriated. But if you look at last month itself, the Bangladesh government submitted 8,000 lists of Rohingya refugees who wanted to return. But the Myanmar government responded back saying that they only verified 500 of them. And if I'm not wrong, so far, none of these people have, in fact, returned to the country yet. So, of course, they are fear for security and those things, but I think most importantly, ethnic identity and this citizenship are the core issues of, and also they are very critical toward finding a sustainable solutions. And finally, let me come to the point why Aung San Suu Kyi, or let's say the NLD leadership, is not speaking out as the way many people in the international community wants them to speak. I think obviously Aung San Suu Kyi had been a democratic icon, a human rights activist for many, many decades. But now, like any politician around the world, she becomes a real politician, and she wants to remain in power. And when you look at the opinion of the larger, let's say, population, who are against of this Rohingya population, so, and again, election is coming up very soon. So it is, in one way, it's very understandable. But we are not condoning, definitely. That's not it's supposed to be. But at least I'm trying to explain why Aung San Suu Kyi is being, let's say, not outspoken on the issue. So she is looking, definitely looking toward her vote bank. And at the same time, she is in a situation where she has to share powers with military, where the military has the upper hand. Thank you very much. I would love to take questions later if there are.
Thank you, Professor Kipgen. And next, we have a little change that was already announced earlier. Originally, we had a different presenter, but there was a swapping of the presentations. So now we have Dr. Salim L-Haqq, International Center for Climate Change and Development, Bangladesh. He'll be speaking on climate change and environmental impact on this issue. Dr. Haque.
Thank you very much. It's on? Okay. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum to all of you. And let me also start by thanking the organizers for inviting me and apologizing at the same time for not being able to join you yesterday morning when I was supposed to have spoken. So my name is Salim L-Haqq. I'm director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development, based at the Independent University in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And I work, as the name implies, on climate change and environmental issues. So what I'm going to speak about is not the climate change issue per se, because the Rohingya problem is more of an environmental problem than it is a climate change problem, although there is a link which I will mention at the end. So in environmental terms, there are broadly 4 issues that we need to be concerned about. And these encompass geographically both within the camps where the Rohingyas are staying at the moment, as well as the surrounding areas. And just to give you a sort of pen picture of the situation, environmental situation in that region, if you were to look at a satellite or an aerial image of that region from about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago from today, you would see a forest where wild elephants come and go. If you look at a picture now, you have a city of nearly 1 million people. It's now the 3rd or 4th largest city in Bangladesh, with people living in huts on precarious conditions on the hillsides, having taken over well over 3,000 hectares of the forest. The elephant trails are still there. Elephants are coming and going, but they have now huts on their trails, and quite a few people have actually lost their lives from the wild elephants who have trampled over them. And we're trying to now divert the elephants. So this, all of a sudden, surge of population and looking after them has obviously created a humanitarian crisis to which the government of Bangladesh, the people of Bangladesh, and the international community, I think, have risen to the challenge of feeding, clothing, housing, providing medical assistance in an emergency modality to this population. I think perhaps as good as any other country in the world might have been able to do, and perhaps much better than many other countries have done. But we now need to think about beyond the immediate humanitarian crisis to the slightly longer term and perhaps even the longer term. So in the slightly longer term, the issue that is most of concern to us from an environmental perspective and also from a disaster management perspective is the upcoming monsoons. The housing and the conditions of the people at the moment on the hills is really very precarious, and in many of the cases, not all, but in many of the cases, if a very strong downpour is going to be quite devastating for them. And efforts are now already being done to identify the most vulnerable households, see whether they can be relocated around the camp to slightly safer parts of the camp. And hopefully that will be fruitful in terms of dealing with the problem, but nevertheless, it doesn't solve the problem. It just tackles it at the most extreme case. And we need to think a little bit more about providing the people themselves with the capacity to deal with the problem as and when it happens, and it will happen. The monsoons are going to come, the rains will come, these people will have to learn how to face it. The associated problem with that, which also we need to think about, is if the area is hit by a cyclone. Hopefully it won't be hit. It doesn't have a long history of cyclones, but there is a possibility of cyclones, and certainly they are not prepared for a cyclone if one were to come. And again, so cyclone preparedness, of which Bangladesh has a very long history and a very good capacity at the national level, needs to be deployed and is being deployed to help the people there. So the immediate environmental crisis are the monsoons and potential cyclones. In the slightly longer term, we also have water supply and sanitation issues which need to be addressed. We are already providing them with tube wells on fairly significant scale. The waste management is now being improved. There are a number of efforts to put in good sanitary waste management programs there. I visited recently to have a look at some of them that were being put in place, and they're actually quite good in my view. However, there are not enough of them. Obviously, we need to do a lot more if we want to improve the sanitary conditions. But the good thing is that we have prevented major outbreaks of disease, particularly of diphtheria, which we had heard. We had been very afraid that might have happened. And I think that, again, is a collective effort of all concerned, particularly the medical cluster and facilities there of identifying the cases of diphtheria and managing to close down the spread of the disease. And in the somewhat longer term, the major issue surrounding the camp area is an ongoing deforestation because of the need for the population to gather firewood and to use it for cooking. This is already causing further deforestation in the area, and we don't really see any major intervention at the moment. We've been trying various kinds of things, including biogas and LPG and others, but this is something that I think we need to pay a bit more attention to provide some kind of fuel wood or energy sources to the population at the moment. Otherwise, the area in that area, the forest area in that area, is going to be continuously degraded, and that's not good for us at all. So looking well beyond the camp, within the camp itself, looking at the safety of the people in terms of the upcoming monsoons and possible cyclones, outside the area, looking at deforestation, and obviously there are issues of the host population in the surrounding area and the Rohingya population, both inside the camps and outside the camps, which I won't go into, but these are issues that need to be looked at and addressed. In the somewhat longer term, we're going to have to think about the relocation issue, which has already been discussed, to what extent that's going to be feasible to relocate in a single place the entire population or to continue some of them here. These are things that will have to be discussed and planned and enabled. And one of the things that a number of us have recommended, those of us who work on the environmental issues, is to put in place a systematic environmental monitoring system so that we can at least collect information on water quality, on quantity, on the locality of the different housing, and as I said, on the deforestation that's occurring, and collect this data on a regular basis and provide that evidence and information to the authorities for decision making on the basis of information. Right now, the situation is that we have a number of ad hoc reports being prepared, one by UNDP, one by FAO, one by other agencies, and although these are very useful and provide good information, they are static, they are time-bound. They give us information at a given point in time in a place which is very rapidly changing. And so regular collection of information by national experts and field workers is something that I think the time has come for the government to consider putting in place a national environmental monitoring system that can collect good information, provide that information to the government and authorities for making decisions. The final point I'd like to make is the connection to climate change. The connection to climate change is not that these people have come here because of climate change. They have obviously come here for political and humanitarian causes from Myanmar. However, the fact that they have come and they are here and we are now having to look after them and think about what will happen to their future and our future together is the kind of thing that we will have to face globally when climate migration begins to happen at scale. And there was a recent report by the World Bank that looked at 3 hotspots across the globe, one in Africa, one in Latin America, and one in South Asia, or the South Asia region within Asia. And they did some modeling to show that the number of climate-induced migrants over the next 30 to 40 years are likely to be in the region of over 143 million people, of whom roughly 10 to 15 will be in South Asia and Bangladesh, which we will have to think about planning and dealing with. And that is not a trivial number. It's not something that we have had before. We have migration internally within Bangladesh. People move from the rural to the urban centers, but the scale of it with climate change happening, particularly from the coastal, low-lying coastal area inland, is going to be very, very significant. And it's something that we need to turn our heads to and try to start thinking about how we can plan that better and ensure that doesn't become a crisis like the Rohingya crisis. And also, how we deal with the Rohingya crisis will also give us lessons on how to deal with future climate migrants. And the lessons that Bangladesh learns on dealing with climate migration are possibly lessons that other countries will then be able to take lessons from. So Bangladesh, in a sense, is a laboratory, not just for climate change adaptation, but also now dealing with migration and refugees and looking after additional populations that are displaced from one place to another, and finding ways to deal with both the host population and the incoming population, both being able to manage the situation and particularly not damage the environment more than necessary. So with that, let me thank the organizers again for inviting me, and I hope that I've been able to make a contribution in the thinking about what we can do about the Rohingya refugee situation in Bangladesh. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Salim L-Haqq, for being brief as well, but also very informative and providing us with some very useful information. Now, we have covered all the 4 designated presentations. and it's supposed to be the time for open discussion, but what I would propose to do is, I'm supposed to make some closing remarks at the end, which I will not do later. I'll try to make a few comments of my own at this point, and then open the floor up for question and answer. So what I'll do is, I'll first go through a few points that I chalked up during as I was listening to the various presentations, and then also make a few general comments on the topic. Now, as I started by saying, talking about the geopolitics, the geography is constant, but the politics is the variable. So since we have a variable and a wide range of variables in the politics of the region, politics of the countries involved, and the international politics, so there is a lot that can be done. We should not consider anything just a given and no changes are possible. So that is something that gives us some hope that if we are faced with a bad situation, there are possibilities of improving the situation. If we think that some of the players are not, are very entrenched in their geopolitical interests, but that is possible. There is a possibility that we can work with them, engage them, and achieve changes that will help us resolve this huge humanitarian crisis. Something that was discussed by the first presenter, that about Bangladesh-Myanmar relations. He was quite, how should I put it? He thought that it was very weak. We have not done enough. It's true that we have not achieved a lot. But if we say that we have not done enough, that may not be exactly accurate, because there are no end of MOUs and agreements in Bangladesh and Myanmar, and we have been engaged with each other for a long time, but all the agreements have not been translated into work. That is also because of this. One of the reasons is the Rohingya crisis has not allowed us to move forward. But we have kept on, the government of Bangladesh has kept on engaging with the government of Myanmar at all times, and has chalked up a huge number of plans and programs that can be done to improve relations between our two countries and have a win-win cooperation. To start with, even immediately after liberation, one of our most experienced diplomats was sent to Myanmar. If somebody remember, some of you remember, Ambassador Khaja Kaisar, he was sent to Myanmar. One of the purposes was to establish a strong bond with our immediate neighbor, Myanmar. But also, of course, one of his other tasks was to, by proxy, also reach out to China, which was at that time not with us, but we wanted, we were from the very beginning very sanguine that we needed China with us in our efforts in nation building, in our efforts to build, develop our economy and all that. So that is one thing that we should keep in mind, that it's not for lack of trying that our relations have not grown that much. One thing that everybody seems to take for granted is that India and China have some interests in Myanmar that will not allow them to change their position or make their position more similar to, nearer to Bangladesh's position. But that, I think, is not completely true. Whatever happens, even if today China and India take very strong position against the Myanmar authorities, current Myanmar authorities, they will always remain important to Myanmar. Once this crisis goes away, they will again make a big comeback in Myanmar's rebuilding. Myanmar is a huge country with huge resources, but not a lot of people. And therefore, they will need a lot of assistance when they really want to go into development mode, when they really unleash their development efforts. And China and India will definitely be very important to them then. And so whatever they do now, China and India, will not be held against them, I'm sure. This is how I see it. And so there is a lot of scope for both China and India to rethink. There was some talk about Rohingya-free Arakan being beneficial for China. I think that is also another myth. Number one, Arakan is a big place. Rohingyas only occupy a rather small part of that province. And the population is useful. They were taken there, many of them, to help with the agriculture and fishing. And they have contributed over years to the economy there. So they are contributing people there, and they are not a liability, they are an asset. And that's how both Myanmar and the rest of the friends of Myanmar should look at that place and the Rohingyas. And when this place becomes a special economic zone, they will need people. Right now, I was talking to some Myanmarese organizations a few days ago in Singapore. They said that they have not been able to build houses for the returnees when they do return, because they don't have enough people there. They want to get some people going back to Arakan, and then they will ask them to build houses. So you know that already they are facing this difficulty. They don't have proper agriculture and fishing if the Rohingyas are not there. So this is something that people should keep in mind, that even if that place is going to be, the Arakan state is going to be a huge place for development, infrastructure building and all that, the Rohingyas will actually be an important asset there. Then there was this thing about ASEAN's role. Yes, I think ASEAN is somewhat stymied by its own norms and all, about not interfering in the internal matters of members. But I think there is something that they can do, and they have done before also, that the other members of ASEAN could come together, discuss it among themselves and find out some common grounds, and then engage the Myanmar government on a bilateral basis, not as ASEAN, but on a bilateral basis. All the different governments could talk to the Myanmar government on the basis of a coordinated line. And then they have the ARF, ASEAN Regional Forum, which is supposed to discuss security issues. And this is definitely a very major security issue. And I think this is another thing that perhaps ASEAN could think about. And the history shows that in the past, ASEAN has addressed some important issues, both security and others, especially in case of Cambodia and Vietnam, and as well as Myanmar. In case of Myanmar, particularly when the whole world was trying to get Aung San Suu Kyi released. So the ASEAN also played its role at that time. So the history is there too. We haven't heard people talk about the recent developments in Myanmar. The resignation of the president, appointment of a new president, then Aung San Suu Kyi's recent visit to Australia and its aftermath. I think that those things may hold some hints for what is happening and what needs to be done, whether we are moving in a particular direction or not. And the recent acceptance of UNHCR as a party in the Rohingya repatriation process, I think that is also something that needs to be kept in mind. It means that progress is being made. One aspect that has not been discussed very much, in this session at least, although I saw something about this in one of the paper's abstracts, that this whole narrative that has created the division in Myanmar has the priests involved in it. The Mabatha movement and some of the priests. But they need to be also a part of the solution instead of being the problem. So the narrative that has been created, the division that has been created, needs to be addressed. And these people who created the original narrative that has created the problem need to be involved in countering that narrative. And that is something that the Myanmar government needs to do. and the international community must put pressure on them to do that. And this is going to be a long-drawn process, but it needs to start now. And about the climate, the environmental, when I was listening to the deforestation thing, I think there was also some physical changes being made to the topography of the place, which also needs to be monitored and taken care of. And a few general remarks. I think Professor Imtiaz in his keynote address yesterday brought this up, the nature of the crisis. It's not a bilateral problem between Bangladesh and Myanmar. It is a problem within Myanmar, but it is so huge and so humanitarian in nature that it is an international problem. So it is a serious humanitarian problem in Myanmar impacting the neighborhood that needs to be resolved through the coordinated effort of the whole of the humanity, that is the international community here. And the crux, or the main point that needs to be kept in mind when we're looking for solutions is the issue of citizenship. So long as this is not addressed, this crisis does not have a long-term solution. And actually, previously I was thinking that this would be the last thing that they do, but I think this should be the starting point. The Myanmar government should demonstrate its goodwill by starting with the law, by changing the law that will create the necessary trust that is lacking right now. And so that is something that we should also be talking about. And I mentioned about the healing process. And of course, whatever, any agreement, any arrangement that we have with the Myanmarese authorities, we have, or the international community, the various international organizations have with the Myanmarese community, is not going to work unless there is genuine goodwill in the Myanmarese authorities. And this goodwill is not necessarily going to be automatic or spontaneous. The goodwill also may be created through sustained and adequate international pressure. With those words, I would now open the floor for the discussion. Please, anyone who wants to speak, identify yourself and make your point precise and brief. No one should try to take more than 2 minutes. Thank you. It's open for question and answer. I will recognize hands that are raised. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Mohammad Abdul Hai. I'm a student of economics of this university.
The name again?
Mohammad Abdul Hai. I have a question to Mr. Ramcharan of India. The unfolding of Rohingya crisis, whereas the Myanmar military planned to destroy as textbook of ethnic cleansing, makes it clear that the issue is no longer limited to Myanmar and Bangladesh, but it is an international and regional issue. What's the question? What's the role the regional actors, particularly India and China, play to settle the Rohingya crisis? And he says in his lecture, if I am clear, he says the great hope from India, right? Is there a little hope of light at the end of the tunnel to settle the Rohingya crisis? That is the genocide for the Rohingya people from India?
I think we get, do you have any more questions?
And yes, a small one, sir.
Yeah, please go ahead.
And other thing, will this question to Professor Tawfique, or I'm sorry, will Myanmar recognize the citizenship of refugee people, really? I think never and ever in reality. Then what would happen, the fate of the 1 million distressed people of Rohingya? yesterday says that 300 or 200 every day is going on and it takes 2027. আমার বাংলায় মনে হচ্ছে যে এটা এমনভাবে যাবে এত বছরে বাস্তবে কি হবে যে শৈবাল দিগেরে বলি উচ্চ করে শির লিখে রাখো এক বিন্দু দিলেম শিশির বাস্তবে কি হবে
I think we have got your point. Next question there.
ঠিক আছে বুঝা গেছে
Thank you. Asif Munir, working on migration and refugee issues. I don't have a question. I think we had a very good array of presentations. But listening to the geopolitics issue, perhaps one thing the organizers can think of, especially Center for Genocide Studies and Ambassador Faiz, your institution as well, in terms of the strategic analysis, research on the military regime. And I mean, we have heard a little bit about the inner politics within Myanmar, but for the world, not just for Bangladesh, to understand the history, but also the operatives in the near future or the long future. Perhaps BIS and other institutions do have your own internal analysis, but I think outside for the civil society to understand, we need to understand a little bit more about how the Myanmar military regime operates. Thank you.
Thank you, Asif. Any next question? Or shall we go to the panelists first and then come back for other questions? Give you time to think. Yeah, is there someone here? Yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Rakib. I'm a student based in Netherlands. So my question is to Mr. Professor Haqq. So in your presentation, you have expressed concern whether Bangladesh is on the right track or not in case of resolving the crisis diplomatically. So my question is, could you put forward a set of recommendations based on your research, what Bangladesh could do or what Bangladesh can do under these present circumstances in order to deal with this crisis? Thank you.
Hands right now. I will let the panelists come on these three interventions, and let's see if there are any other questions afterwards. Yes, would you like to come first?
Thank you for your question. I'm not representing India here, but we're based in Bangkok. But on the substance of your point, I think the chair has provided the answer as to the long-term solution, which is the question of, and it was also mentioned in another presentation, it's about citizenship. So if there is a root cause of the problem, it's this. You know, we've had a suggestion that it be placed up front rather than on the back burner or as an issue to be settled later. But I'm not optimistic on that front. In terms of what ASEAN can do, well, there was a suggestion that, okay, maybe they can have pressure on a bilateral basis. I think speaking to that may be the insistence of Malaysia to have a meeting with Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, and I think this took place among the leaders, I believe it was, correct me if I'm wrong, December of last year at some point, where she had to explain what was going on. But you know, citizenship, I think I'll leave it there.
The last question, is it directed to me because we have two Haqq here?
I think it was.
Oh, is it to me? Okay. Okay, the first question is, will Myanmar recognize the ethnicity? Yeah. I think the second presenter very clearly, or third presenter very clearly identified the Myanmar government's policies that ethnicity is the main problem there. They are not going to recognize Rohingyas as in Rohingya. So there's this period. That is definitely not going to be happen. Even if it happens that they are going to be repatriated, they will have to be repatriated as a Bengali settlers. So that's the Myanmar government position. It's not going to be changed. I'm not very hopeful. I am a bit, I was a bit provocative, but I still think that because there is a track record. The Myanmar government's position is very consistent after 1982. It's not a new position. It is us who did not follow that positions. It's our problem that we didn't understand that it's coming. And that's why I was a bit provocative, I was a bit frustrated, and those the questions I was asking, that were we ready? Because it was been happening. And then as you, this question came that this repatriation, I think is a myth. I'm very blunt, but I think this is a myth. It's not going to be happen. They will ask us to give the list, then they will send us, after 8,000, they will say that, okay, 5,000 is accepted, and then those 5,000, when they scrutinize, they will come out with the 500, then after final scrutinization, they will say that, no, 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 we can take 50. And those 50 will not be ready to go, because no security is there. So we'll have to get ready that these people will live in this country, or what we can do, we have to plan like this. We need to be, I think we should not be befooling ourselves, because Myanmar government's positions, their policies are consistent, they know what they are doing, and they are absolutely fine with it. And as you said that what is the solutions, and just before that I will just take 1 minute, that just to make it understand, our chairman also said that some of the points. I think by this whole scenario, it is very unpleasant to say, but it is by this whole episode of this crisis, the military regime of Myanmar is the main party who got benefited. Suu Kyi has been blamed for everyone, they are very happy with it. Everyone is blaming Suu Kyi, not Myanmar regimes as such. They are very happy with it. They are more powerful than before. And the democratic process and democratic regimes are at stake now. So Myanmar government, Myanmar military regime seeing it all opportunities, this crisis. Economically, as I was saying that, it is unfortunate, but this is ultimately the Chinese economic interest is also in a very good position now. So China and Myanmar's military regimes are the winners out of this whole crisis. I'm sorry to say that. And then Rohingyas are the real losers. And Bangladesh, we are at the no man's land. We have to now decide that where we want to go. And we have to plan we will negotiate, as Ambassador Munshi was saying, that definitely we will make more MOUs, we will make more commitments and agreements, but also we'll have to understand that Myanmar did not comply with any agreements before. The last influx also happened and they said we will take back. They didn't take back. So we have to understand, we will negotiate, we will make it more popular and make it visible in the international arena, but we will also have to have a backup plan. The backup plan that the Myanmar will not accept our goodwills and they will not comply with international laws.
That was very pessimistic. Yes, we'll take your point, but I think we don't need to be, we have not come to a point when you need to be that pessimistic. I think we are making progress. Yes, it's slow, but definitely we've seen changes in many people's statements and positions. Myanmar government's position has changed quite substantially since the beginning of the crisis this time. And so we have seen the Chinese position, the Indian position. Originally everybody was frustrated with the Chinese position and the Indian position. But then we see the Indian government representative at the UNHRC make a very scathing statement condemning the Myanmar atrocities on Rohingyas. And also we see the Chinese coming forward trying to help Bangladesh and Myanmar resolve this issue through their 3-point solution. Yes, we have not made a lot of progress, but definitely we see changes, we see progress being made, and there is no point in giving up, saying that no, this cannot be, then we should stop trying everything, but we are still trying. The people are asking the government to continue to try, the government is trying, everybody else in the international community is trying, so we should not give up hope. I'm sure we should be able to find appropriate solutions to these issues. So let us all have patience and make some constructive propositions that would help the government, help the people, and not create more difficulties. I think that is how we should look at this. Yes, did any of the other two panelists want to say something on these 3 questions? If not, then I go to Professor Imtiaz.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to flag, this pessimist view. Only two kinds of states can do what you are saying. One is if you're a rogue state, and second is if you are a superpower. Let's be very realistic. Myanmar is not a superpower. Let's be very clear on that. Number two, it was a rogue state, and it started to deconstruct and tries to be a normal state. So I don't know why we are flagging this pessimist view. The reason I'm saying, even the issue of self-identification, and I don't know whether people are, knowledgeable of that. There are international instruments which clearly makes this point that humans have the right to self-identification. European Court of Human Rights has an article on that. So the self-identification is a human right, and it's part of the international legal instruments. So I don't think Myanmar, in the long run, if the Rohingya population says we are Rohingyas, or even if I say that I am, I don't know, if I can find the self-identification, I am Dhaka University student, I can use that. I have the right. So I don't see, because as I said, it's not a superpower, and it's trying to come up from a rogue state. So the point here is, what we have to do is to start building structures after structures. The concept I was using, circle of spaces. You create circle of spaces, one after another, so that you make Myanmar understand that this circle of spaces is much stronger than what you think you are. So that, I think, is what I believe Bangladesh is doing. Maybe slowly, a little bit, to our expectations. It has to be geared up. I see that our foreign minister is in Moscow. That's a kind of development we'd love to. Probably a month back would have been even better, but still, better late than never. So the circle of spaces are being established. Our task could be, how can we contribute, both the GO and NGO, in a partnership? How can we contribute to these circular spaces? Now, the reason why I'm saying that this has nothing to do with Bangladesh and Myanmar. This has absolutely nothing to do with geopolitics and all. It has to do with human beings' dignity, a person's dignity. It can be Rwanda, it can be Germany, it can be anywhere in the world. That's the issue that we have to deal. These stateless people ought to be given the right that they have. So as human beings, we are not here just because we are Bangladeshi and suffering from rivers. I would have done the same thing for the Rwanda population, or for the Armenians, or any genocide anywhere in the world. That should be the one. I think we are living in the same boat. And in the age of globalization, I don't think we can give signals to Myanmar that you can get away by, doing what you have done.
Okay, please.
I think I was probably a little bit misunderstood. I never said that we should give up. I said that we should have contingency backup plans. We should try all the diplomatic, all other kinds of the things, but we need a kind of a backup plan that what if they don't comply? And they did not comply. The track record says that the 40 years of Myanmar history says that they didn't care about international laws. So if they do the same thing this times, yes, they are coming out as a rogue state, but probably still with disguise, some kind of so we need a backup plan. We should not, yes, we will make agreements, but also we have to think about if they don't go with what will we do. And the world is not in the same situation like 10, 15 years ago when the international human rights laws and instruments were so important. So we need to have our plan B, plan C, plan D. So that's my point. So not like trusting them and just sit down and just believe that this is the ideal world we are living and the people are rational there in Yangon. So we have to have our own kind of the backup thing. And the last point that I want to make it is that we also have to know about the inner circle of the Myanmar politics, as Monir was saying. After the Rohingya crisis, the research and the other kinds of the information we are getting from Myanmar, internally the government in Myanmar became more popular than before. Again, I'm sorry to say these things in this forum, but that's the reality. Don't just make your eyes blind and just think that the Myanmar government absolutely doing fine within Myanmar. They are more popular than before by just doing these things. The other ethnic groups, they are unified. Regarding this Rohingya, all Myanmar ethnic groups are unified.
Thank you. I think we understand your point. Before I go to the Foreign Secretary, I'll just add one or two things to what Professor Imtiaz said. I think that is the prerogative of the chair. Yes, I have a right to decide who I call myself. That is what I have been talking about also in different fora, that it is up to the Rohingyas themselves what they want to call them. It is not going to be decided by the Myanmarese authorities. It is not going to be decided by Bangladesh or China or anybody else. It will be decided by them. But in order to achieve some progress in this thing, Bangladesh and Myanmar have agreed to not use certain words at certain times. That is only tactical. But ultimately, we do not decide for the Rohingyas, for these people, who they are. They will decide it for themselves. But what we are trying to achieve is to ensure that the rights that they inherited at the time of Myanmar's independence in 1948 through the 1947 constitution and subsequent times, those rights have been taken away from them. Those rights need to be restored back to them. Without that, there is no solution. The problem is there, and the solution has to be there. But now let's hear from the Foreign Secretary.
Sorry, I'll try and be short, and if the chair allows me, I would like to speak in Bangla. যাতে আমাদের ডার্টি লিলেন আমাদের কাছেই থাকে, হ্যাঁ, সেই কারণে আসলে একটা বিষয় যে আমরা এখানে একটা একাডেমিক এক্সারসাইজে এসেছি এবং এখানে যখন একটা সরকারের উপরে একটা দেশের একটা রাষ্ট্রযন্ত্রের উপরে অ্যাসপারশন আনা হয়, তার আগে 10 বার চিন্তা করা উচিত যে এইটা ঠিক হচ্ছে কিনা এবং এইটা ঠিক কিনা। তা না হলে হয় কি যে মনে হবে যে আসলেই রাষ্ট্রযন্ত্র বোধহয় ভেঙে পড়েছে, কিছুই করছে না, কখনো কিছু করেনি। এইটা ভুল। আপনি এখানে 5টা প্রশ্ন তুলেছেন। ডক্টর হক বলেছেন যে এটা আমরা কারেক্টলি অ্যাসেস করতে পেরেছি কিনা। ইউ হ্যাভ এভরি রাইট টু আস্ক দ্যাট কোয়েশ্চেন। বাট আপনি কি একবার চেষ্টা করেছেন জানার জন্য যে আসলে পররাষ্ট্র মন্ত্রণালয়, সরকারে অন্যান্য মন্ত্রণালয় এই রোহিঙ্গা ইস্যু নিয়ে কী করা হয়েছে, এতদিন কী করা হচ্ছে? আপনি এক নাগাড়ে বলেই যাচ্ছেন যে ব্যাকআপ প্ল্যান কী, ব্যাকআপ প্ল্যান কী। আপনি কি কখনো জানার চেষ্টা করেছেন এই রিসার্চ রিপোর্টটা তুলে ধরার আগে এই ইন্টারন্যাশনাল একটা কমিউনিটির সামনে যে আসলেই কি সরকার কি করছে, কিভাবে চিন্তা করছে, কি ব্যাকআপ প্ল্যান আছে? এক, এবং আপনি খুব সুন্দর করে প্রশ্নবদ্ধ দিয়েছেন। অনেক সময় প্রশ্ন অনেক বেশি বলে আনসারের চাইতে। তো আমি বলবো যে আপনি ওইটা জেনে তারপরে এই ধরনের প্রশ্ন তুলবেন। সেকেন্ড প্রশ্ন আপনি তুলেছেন যে মিথ অ্যান্ড রিয়েলিটি। আসলে স্টেট কিভাবে ফাংশন করে সেইটা কিন্তু স্টেটের নেচার দেখে বোঝা যায়। আমরাও, আপনি যেরকম জানেন, আমরাও কিন্তু জানি যে এখানে যে কমিটমেন্ট করা হচ্ছে এটা ঠিকভাবে করা হচ্ছে না। আপনি তো নেগোসিয়েশনে বসেন নাই, স্টেটের রিপ্রেজেন্টেটিভরা নেগোসিয়েশনে বসে, তারা ফিল করতে পারে যে এটা কতটুক জেনুইন, কতটুক জেনুইন না। সুতরাং কোনো একটা উদ্যোগকে এইভাবে কালার্ড করে দেওয়াটা একাডেমিক পারপাসে ঠিক আছে, বাট ইন রিয়েলিটি ঠিক নেই, বিশেষ করে যখন একটা আন্তর্জাতিক কনফারেন্স হয়। এটা আপনার ক্লাসরুমে আপনি ইউ হ্যাভ দ্য এভরি রাইট টু সে দিস। তারপর আপনি বলেছেন যে আমরা কি চায়না আর মিয়ানমারের পকেটে চলে গেলাম কিনা, দ্যাট কোয়েশ্চেন। আমার মনে হয় যে এগুলো ঠিক মতো গভীরভাবে না জেনে এইভাবে প্রশ্ন করে ইভেন আমাদের যারা ছাত্র আছে তাদের মধ্যে একটা সংশয় দানা বাঁধানো ঠিক না। সুতরাং আমি খুব একটু ক্রিটিক্যালি বললাম, এবং আপনি একটা জায়গায় বলেছেন যে রাষ্ট্র কি পথ হারিয়েছে, পথিক তুমি কি পথ হারিয়েছো, এই ধরনের কথা বলে হাততালি পাওয়া যায়, কিন্তু রিয়েলিটির থেকে অনেক দূরে, এবং এতে কোনো লাভ হয় না। এটা রোহিঙ্গাদের ব্যাপারেও লাভ হয় না, আমাদের ব্যাপারে লাভ হয় না, এবং আপনারা যাদেরকে পড়ান তাদেরও লাভ হয় না। সুতরাং আমার রিকোয়েস্ট হলো যে প্লিজ আপনারা জেনে তারপরে এই ধরনের প্রশ্ন তুলবেন। থ্যাংক ইউ।
ধন্যবাদ Foreign Secretary. Thank you very much, Foreign Secretary. Actually, yesterday I was present at the inaugural session, and the Foreign Secretary went into some length describing what the government has been doing, and I think that was a very open elaboration of government's policies and various efforts. And after listening to that, we are not, I mean, we should not make such very generalized comments which are so negative, because it's not that. Bangladesh is trying pretty hard. The international community has been commending Bangladesh's efforts, but of course we must admit that we have not yet made a lot of progress in terms of repatriation. But then everybody, whenever we think in terms of repatriation, when the first arrangement was signed, people said, why was there such a hurry? Then the government took some time. And then again, why is the delay? These are, I think we should read between the lines a little, and also have a little patience, because this is a crisis that has been created over more than 60 years. Actually, some people say that the genesis of the problem was the Second World War. Prior to that, the communities in Rakhine, the Rohingyas and the Rakhine, they lived very peacefully together. We had a visit from Myanmar's delegation, which included some people who actually were born and brought up in the Rakhine province. They said that they had Rohingya friends. Then Aung San Suu Kyi's father had Rohingya comrades in the war of liberation, in the struggle for liberation. So all these things are there. The history is there. We should not forget this. And it has been created, as people say, that over the years. And since 1962, this has been really given a direction, which from then, when we talk about ethnic cleansing, when we talk about genocide, when we talk about atrocities against, crimes against humanity, these things have evolved over the years and only taken a really huge proportion this time round. But it has continued over the years, and so this will take some time to resolve. But one good thing has happened is that because of the huge proportion of the crime this time, or crisis this time, it has drawn the attention of the international community, and that will create the atmosphere in which we can look for solutions, and that is what is being done right now. Do we have any more questions? Since we do not have any more questions, anybody? Oh, there, please. Your mic.
Okay. That's not on politics again. That's a question to Dr. Salim L-Haqq. I am Muhammad Riazuddin. Perhaps Dr. Salim L-Haqq also could speak on carbon footprint of the Rohingya influx. Thank you.
Thank you. And there is a question from a lady there.
Thank you, sir. This is Nabila Naushin from Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Not on geopolitics, I have a question to Professor Imtiaz, if I may. Yesterday, you sir mentioned about the archetype of singularity. As an academician, I would like to hear your views about this rise of right-wing populism throughout the world. Do you really have any instrument to work against this, make America great again, or in France, or in Germany, even in Norway and Sweden? And if there is a possibility of rising another right-wing populism in Bangladesh against the Buddhists due to this crisis? Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Naushin. And here, Farah.
Thank you, Chair. again, my question is to Dr. Salim L-Haqq and also maybe to our Foreign Secretary, that given the, even though we are talking, we are saying that it is an environmental impact as a result of the Rohingya refugees crossing over and being hosted in that area, are we going to wait for the next 20 years and then bring it to the international community and talk about loss and damage? Or are we now in a position to take this issue up to the international community and emphasize on the loss and damage, because we know water levels has depleted, deforestation or forest destruction has happened. There are that many people breathing, eating, walking. So there are many things that, like the carbon footprint that was highlighted. So as Bangladesh is again going to be leading on developing a national mechanism for loss and damage, the government of Bangladesh is working on that. Maybe this is the opportune moment to take it to the world and talk about loss and damage. I would like your thoughts on that.
Thank you. I think we have enough for the panelists to take now, but we have two new panelists now, Professor Imtiaz and the Foreign Secretary. And so let's start with Professor Imtiaz.
Thank you. Well, let me try to be very brief. Archetype of singularity is something, this is Gustav Jung, the psychologist, particularly archetype. The archetype of singularity is something that we never took it seriously. Let's take the case of Europe. After Nazi Germany, with 6 million Jews getting killed, 22 million Russians, one day in Dresden, 40,000 got killed. Whole of Europe thought that with democracy, with election, this will be over. But the archetype, according to Gustav Jung, it remains in the brain, particularly the collective unconscious. Because somehow we have this idea that a child, when a child comes out, the brain is fresh, which is not. Because we do say that, oh, the child looks like her father or mother. The nose is just like father, or the eyes are just like mother. If that is the case, then part of the brain remains. So it's hereditary. It goes on. And it remains not as an individual, it remains as a collective unconscious. Somehow we have not tackled that. And I say that even for South Asia, and that's the reason why genocide is terrible, because you will have children after children who probably have not experienced 71 at all, but their parents and grandparents, since they have suffered the 10 million refugees, 3 million getting killed, thousands of getting raped, that will remain in the brain. Now what do you do with that? So you have to consciously get out of this collective unconscious. You have to tackle it, continue it, you have to start curriculum, you have to face it. You can't hide it. And that's where I think we made a terrible mistake in 1947. Tapunda would know more, better on that. 1947, to me and to many of us, is genocidal. It's a genocidal partition. It's this huge genocidal partition. But we have never taken seriously 1947 as a genocidal partition. And that's the reason probably now we see the right-wing forces telling something which is quite ironic. Professor Rahman Soban very recently read out a paper in Guwahati and almost saw Jinnah in Narendra Modi. It's the similarity between the two. So you can well imagine this very idea of two-nation theory, something that we thought that India will get out of that, but it hasn't. It has come back. So this coming back is something that I think Myanmar is now going through. It has to, because look at the history of Myanmar. They had a serious discourse with fascism also. Don't forget Aung San Suu Kyi's father did line up with fascist forces, had a salute as good as any fascist group, and that has not been contained. So what do you do with that? But I see hope, because once we know that there is a collective unconscious and archetype of singularity is there in Myanmar, and this is something I think Munir was also trying to refer to, I think we need to address that. And there are a lot of Myanmar people that I know they are all also interested in that kind of exercise. Once that is done, I believe we'll be able to at least, at least know the thing and how to overcome. Not that it's going to, you can't do it one day, and that's the reason why among the 5 challenges, that's number 1 challenge, I think, and that's a serious challenge that we all have to be conscious about.
Thank you, Professor Imtiaz. I think the next 5 minutes is for Foreign Secretary. Oh, you'll come in first and then Foreign.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for the 2 questions. I'll address the 2 questions, and if I might also add a third comment of my own. So firstly, Mr. Riazuddin's question about the carbon footprint. The remarks that I made, particularly about the deforestation for the several thousand hectares that have been deforested for the Rohingya refugee population in the camps, and the continuous deforestation for firewood, these are all negative carbon footprints. So we are cutting trees, which is not good for carbon sequestration, unfortunately. On the other hand, interesting feature of the Rohingyas, for those of you who've been there and seen them, you'll see that a lot of the refugees, when they were coming across the border, they have a little solar panel under their arm. They bring their solar panels with them. And they are used to using solar panels. And that's if you like, a possible opportunity for us to look at solar energy as one of the forms in which we provide them with energy going forward. There's already quite a few solar panels that have been deployed at the communal spaces for the toilets and for where their communities are, but we may think beyond that into even the household level going forward. It's one of the aspects of a solution that we might think about. Not that the carbon footprint is very big, but it is there, and we need to recognize it and think about what we can do about it. With regard to Farah's question on loss and damage, I think you raise a very, very good point, which is worth exploring for us. Because for those of you who are not familiar, in the climate change regime, we have this issue called loss and damage, which is about how to compensate for the impacts of climate change. And there are 2 aspects for doing that. Firstly, to be able to estimate the loss itself. How much is it? How much are we losing? And this is a good example for us to do some estimations on how much is it costing Bangladesh. But secondly, we need to also think about attributing that harm to the impacts of climate change. And increasingly now, and I would argue, 2017 is our tipping point when the world has already moved into a climate changed world, which means that from now on, every cyclone, every flood, every drought can be attributed to human-induced climate change in terms of its intensity. Not that it happens because of climate change, but it is more intense because of climate change, and hence the harm it does is greater because of climate change. And I think we have a potential chance here to be able to do some number crunching, some estimations, some scientific assessments, and make the case that Bangladesh would be able to claim compensation for loss and damage. Whether that is actually paid by somebody or not doesn't really matter. The case can be made a very strong case, and I would very much urge the government and be happy to help the government in trying
Thank
to put
you,
that
Dr.
together.
Salim L-Haqq.
Thank you.
Would the Foreign Secretary like 1 or 2 minutes?
Only just responding to Farapa's call for going into the loss and damage mechanism with the Rohingya cases. Certainly, actually, yesterday there was a debate in the cabinet as to how much damage the arrival of the Rohingyas has caused to the environment. It was tremendous. Someone who has flown over this area a number of times, helicopter, I have seen personally how the deep forests were, as rightly pointed out, Elephant Pass, and how the situation is now. It's horrific, and I've been going to that area now about 25 years. So I've seen gradual depletion of our resources there. Now, I know that Farab is doing a study along with the UNDP and others. In fact, it was also discussed with us in terms of environmental impacts. Once that is ready, we will be very happy to take it to loss and damage mechanism, although that mechanism has its own internal difficulties and limitations. But so far I remember, I don't think ever something like this, the arrival of refugee, how much damage it could do to the host community's environment has ever been taken to the lost and found issues. But nevertheless, this is a very peculiar situation. And if I recall, even the European situation about a year back, about 2 years back, when about 1 million Syrian, Afghani, and Pakistanis walked over to Europe, it didn't do the level of damage that has been done to our part of the Cox's Bazar. Although now we are trying to contain it in terms of giving them various fuel system to be able to cook for themselves and minimize it, but damage has been done. And I hope that the impact of the damage would be seen this time with the monsoon. We'll see how much damage it could cause to an area which has gone through the rapid and absolute deforestations, including the roots of the trees. So that will be a very good case. So I look forward for your help. Once it is there, we'll have a consultations and we can take it forward. That be also pioneering a case which is not typical of citizens' impact on the climate, rather non-citizens' impact on the climate. One good thing is that World Bank has, after a long struggle within itself, taken on these refugee issues as part of their major program. So at least we will have one less opposition in terms of loss and damage. We are also engaging with the World Bank in this, so we could also encourage them to help us in taking this onto the international arena. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. And since I made my comments already during the progress of the session, so I don't have any other concluding remarks, but to thank all the panelists and all of the people present here for enthusiastically participating in this session. And before I am deposed, I abdicate. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, now we'll go for a very, very short tea break and prepare for the final session of the international conference with segments, Dhaka Declaration and valedictory speech by Dr. Gohar Rizvi. So hopefully see you all within 10 minutes. Thank you.
आज शांति न मैं तुम्हारी थी बोला कि आने वाली है हाँ बाजी रे पानी पानी हाय पानी एक पानी हवा हाँ बाजी
তোমার আব্বা মা কেউ নাই
নাই বেশি মানুষ গাড়ি বেলায়
More
আর সব সম্মান মরে গেছে
এগারো দিন নাকি আর তো আইতে বেশি কষ্ট করে আছি যারা তো ওই পয়েন্টে হনদুল্লাহ ফরানো লালো ধরে আগে যদি বেশি দুপুরে আছি
We have a young mother here who has just given birth to her baby son yesterday. She has 6 children in total now, including this newborn child. The camps have identified young mothers and pregnant women and put up yellow flags over the tents, but no support is yet to be deployed to the pregnant mothers and for newborn babies.
We are right in the middle of Balukhali camp. People don't have latrine, there's no wash, sanitation. So I cannot describe the dire need here. They don't know what the future is. They don't know what tomorrow is. All they're trying to do is survive.